The first signs of the collapse were subtle. A quiet tremor beneath the feet of the industrial Midwest before the earthquake tore it all apart. It wasn't a single headline, but a slow, dawning realization in towns like Flint and Lansing that the familiar rhythm of life, the shift's whistles, the lunch pail traffic, the proud knowledge that you were building something was beginning to falter. The chaos, when it fully erupted, didn't come from a factory fire or a natural disaster, but from a series of boardroom decisions made in reaction to a political storm, decisions that would unravel decades of industrial fabric in a matter of months. It began, as these crises often do, with a promise to protect the American auto worker. A new wave of aggressive tariffs designed to force the world to play by Washington's rules. But the world, it turned out, had other plans. The first devastating blow landed not on foreign competitors, but on the very heart of American manufacturing, when Toyota, a pillar of stability in the state for over 3 decades, made the stunning announcement that it was halting production at its flagship assembly plant in Georgetown, Kentucky, and shifting its crown jewel, the Camry and the Avalon, to a sprawling new facility in Ontario. The news was a shockwave, but it was the rationale that cut deep. Executives didn't speak of quality or demand, but of survival, stating plainly that the new tariff regime had made building cars in the United States economically impossible. The math, they said, simply no longer worked. Almost overnight, the unthinkable became reality. A factory that had been a symbol of successful foreign investment, a place that employed thousands of Americans who built cars that were sold to Americans, was being shuttered not for lack of skill or profit, but by the very policies claiming to defend them. The panic was immediate and visceral. In Michigan, where the air itself sometimes smells of gasoline and rust, a cold dread set in. If Toyota, with its legendary efficiency and deep-rooted supply chain, was fleeing, what chance did the others have? The answer came swiftly, and it was brutal. Honda, in a move that felt like a coordinated retreat, followed within days, declaring it would transition production of its best-selling Civic and CR-V models from its massive Marysville, Ohio, complex to its plants in Alliston, Canada. The reason was a mirror image of Toyota's, the 25% tariff on imported aluminum and steel. Components that were the literal skeleton of every vehicle had eviscerated their cost structure. The company's statement was a masterpiece of corporate regret, expressing profound sadness at the move, while simultaneously laying the blame squarely at the feet of the new economic policy. The fallout was not contained to the assembly lines. It bled instantly into the vast, intricate ecosystem of suppliers, the foundries that cast engine blocks, the fabricators that stamped body panels, the tiny machine shops that produced a specific bolt or bracket. A single auto assembly plant is the sun in a small solar system, and when it goes dark, every planet in its orbit freezes. A parts manufacturer in Grand Rapids, employing 400 people, announced layoffs of half its workforce the same week Honda made its announcement. They weren't building the whole car, but they built a critical sensor for the Civic's braking system. And with that order gone, their reason for existing vanished. The term supply chain suddenly felt terrifyingly fragile, not a chain of steel, but of glass. Shattering link by link, the human costs began to materialize, not in statistics, but in empty driveways and quiet kitchens. Mark, a team leader at the Honda transmission plant in Anna, Ohio, for 17 years, described the moment the news broke as a sucker punch to the gut. The life he had built, the mortgage on a modest 3-bedroom house, his daughter's upcoming college tuition, the reliable rhythm of a Friday paycheck was suddenly built on sand. He wasn't just facing a layoff. He was facing the obsolescence of a highly specific skill set in a region where his skills were rapidly becoming irrelevant. The anxiety was a physical presence in his home, a silent dinner guest every night. His story was multiplied by tens of thousands across the industrial belt. The United Auto Workers Union, which had fought for years to organize and protect these very workers, found itself in a nightmare scenario, powerless against a geopolitical economic decision. They condemned the tariffs not as a tool of protection, but as a self-inflicted wound. a weapon that had been aimed outward but had blown up in the hands of the people it was meant to shield. Picket lines felt futile. Who were they protesting? A foreign corporation making a logical business decision? Or their own government for creating the conditions that made that decision inevitable? This confusion, this sense of betrayal with no clear betrayer, created a pervasive despair that settled over entire communities. As the spring of 2026 wore on, the crisis metastasized from an industrial collapse into a full-blown municipal and state budget catastrophe. Towns that had structured their entire tax base around these industrial behemoths watched their financial futures evaporate. The city manager of a small town outside the Toyota plant in Kentucky described staring at spreadsheets that showed a projected 40% drop in property tax revenue and a similar plunge in local income taxes. The discussion in the town council no longer centered on repaving roads or funding the library, but on which essential services would have to be cut first. Would it be the police force? The fire department? School funding? The very infrastructure that made the town a viable place to live and work was being systematically dismantled by a chain of events that started in Washington, D.C. and ended with a locked factory gate. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, the markets reacted with predictable, cold logic. Shares of companies reliant on the domestic auto supply chain plummeted. Financing for new automotive startups, once a vibrant sector, dried up overnight. Banks began classifying loans to Michigan and Ohio-based manufacturing businesses as high risk, choking off the capital that might have allowed some to pivot or survive. The state of Michigan, its budget already stretched, faced the prospect of having to fund unprecedented unemployment claims while its tax revenue was in freefall. The governor gave a somber address pleading for federal aid, a request that landed in a Capitol gripped by partisan paralysis, each side blaming the other for the disaster unfolding in the heartland. The global ripples were just as severe. With Toyota and Honda aggressively shifting production to Canada, a massive, unplanned strain was placed on the North American supply chain. The wheel-oiled logistics of just-in-time delivery, system that ensured parts arrived at factories hours before they were needed, completely broke down. Trucking routes that had run for decades from Indiana to Ohio were now obsolete, while new, longer, and more expensive routes from Windsor to Ontario had to be created from scratch. Ports in British Columbia saw unprecedented congestion as container ships, carrying specialized components from Japan, were rerouted from California. The cost to ship a container from Asia to the port of Vancouver tripled in a month. And those increased costs, of course, were passed down, making the cars built in Canada more expensive even before they hit the showroom floor. This inefficiency introduced friction and cost into a system that was prized for its sleekness, undermining the very competitive advantage Canada was supposed to offer. And in a cruel twist of irony, some American suppliers, in a desperate bid to stay alive, began exploring how to open their own satellite facilities in Canada, a move that would see them exporting American jobs in order to continue supplying their old customers. A perfect and tragic illustration of a policy backfiring by the early summer. The landscape of the American auto industry was unrecognizable. Dealerships, once filled with a diverse inventory, began to see alarming shortages. Popular models like the Camry and the CR-V became subject to wait lists and massive dealer markups, pushing reliable transportation out of reach for the average American family, just as the cost of living was soaring elsewhere. The used car market, a traditional pressure valve, went into a frenzy, with prices for 5-year-old compacts climbing to levels once reserved for new vehicles. For the American consumer, the crisis was no longer an abstract news story about tariffs and trade wars. It was the shocking number at the bottom of a car loan document. It was the impossibility of finding a safe, affordable vehicle for their teenager. It was the realization that the American-made concept had become so hopelessly tangled in a global web that trying to pull one thread had unraveled the entire sweater. The political rhetoric, which had promised a renaissance of roaring factories and reclaimed industrial glory, rang hollow in the eerie quiet of shuttered plants. The narrative had flipped. This was not a story of America standing up to the world, but of America isolating itself from the complex. Interconnected reality of modern manufacturing, with its own workers paying the heaviest price. The question hanging in the air, thick and suffocating as the humidity over a dead factory. What would be left to rebuild when the political winds finally changed? The backbone of a century of industry was not just strained. The diagnosis from the heart of the heartland was a fracture. A break so severe that the patient might never walk the same way again.